This is Research Like a Pro, episode 302, Examining Family Lore. Was Eliza Ann a Cherokee? Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com. Well, it's Research Like a Pro again. How's everyone doing? Hi, Mom.
Hi, Nicole. I'm excited to be here talking about genealogy again with you. It's always so fun.
Right? It is. We've just been pre-talking and it's always exciting with all the new tools with DNA and with artificial intelligence. There's always something new to learn and we're having way too much fun.
Yeah, I don't think when we started this in 2003 that we had any idea where the field of genealogy would be going. So it is super fun.
Right? Tell me what you've been doing for your Clumsy Klein project.
Well, this last assignment was to work with segment data. So I have been going over to MyHeritage and GEDmatch and finding people who match on the Klein line and then painting those segments into DNA Painter. And it's been really great because I have identified a specific segment through triangulation on chromosome 22. And, it's always really fun to identify a segment that's coming from a third great grandparent. I don't have many of those figured out yet. So it's exciting to see. And really, I had to do a lot of work to get to the point where I'd even recognize these DNA matches and who they were and where they were coming from. So it really is a testament to doing the whole process. Learn about your matches, figure them out, and then you start getting more and more evidence from the DNA.
It's so true. Good job. Announcements. Our Research Like a Pro webinar series for May is going to be by Scott Dixon, who is a graduate of Research Like a Pro. And the title of his class will be Who Was Mary F.E. DeShazo? A case study using indirect evidence in burned counties. So we're excited to hear him talk about that. Here's the description. Mary was born in a county whose records burned. She was married and lived in 2 counties whose records burned. It seemed that wherever she went, disaster followed her. How then to determine who her parents were and what her surname was? This case study uses indirect evidence and negative evidence to identify a probable family of origin in antebellum and Reconstruction era Mississippi. And the topics that will be covered are Mississippi, burned counties, indirect evidence, negative evidence, War of 1812 pension, tax records, land records, and census records. So we are excited for that. Also, the next Research Like a Pro study group begins August of 2024 this year. And if you'd like to be a peer group leader for that, please apply on our website and you would receive free registration. To get news and updates, join our newsletter. It comes out every Monday with our latest blog posts, podcast episodes, videos on YouTube, and any coupons. For upcoming conferences, we will be both presenting at the National Genealogical Society Conference this month, May 17th, and we are excited for all of the wonderful lectures. I've been seeing some really great topics come up in the NGS newsletter, so I'm excited for the whole conference.
I am too. NGS always has fresh new lectures, and it's always really fun to see the breadth of those, all sorts of different topics. And for this one, I am doing one on writing stories of ancestors, which is a really fun topic for me because often I'm, discussing the Research Like a Pro methodology or specific record types. So we're going to have a lot of fun in my class talking all about writing.
Yay. I love that topic. And you've done so much writing, especially last year when you did every week a different profile or biography of an ancestor.
Right. And I learned a lot of little tips and tricks that I will be sharing. So hopefully a lot of our listeners will be logging on to the NGS virtual conference and can watch our lectures. It would be so fun. Well, today we are going to talk about one of those ancestors that I like to write about, and this is Eliza Ann Isenhour. She was alive between 1850 and 1898. So she didn't live to have a really long life. She died when she was about 48 years old, and she still had a lot of younger children. So we'll talk a little bit about her life. But the reason I wanted to research her was because we had a story that she was a full-blooded Cherokee, and I had pictures of her. It's a very faint, kind of a blurry picture of both her and her husband. And she doesn't really look Cherokee, but as we'll talk about, this was a story that had been handed down in our family. So I wanted to talk about this whole idea about family lore. So the first story that we'll start with is about the tragic accident in 1884 that made her a widow with 4 young children and another one on the way. And her husband, William Henderson Shults, had been riding his horse, and his younger brother, Dick Shults, whipped the horse in fun, and the horse started bucking, and William held on until blood ran from his ears. So this had caused internal injuries, and it resulted in his death. This story was told by my dad and his dad, and it was always just exactly the same. I would try to get more details, but they didn't know anything more than that. Well, Eliza remarried, and she had another son named Calvin by her second husband, Jacob Meek, and they moved north from Brown County, Texas to Indian Territory by 1898, where she died. And as I said, she was fairly young. She died of pneumonia, I believe. And her descendants all reported she was full-blooded Cherokee. It didn't come down just through my branch of the family. It came down through other branches of the family as well. So, of course, I wanted to research her and try to figure this out. So, starting at the beginning with Eliza, she was born in Arkansas, according to her census records. And in 1850, she was in the household of her parents, Barnett and Mary Ann Isenhour. And even though we don't really have relationships in that census, there's no reason to suspect that this wasn't a family grouping. The family was enumerated in Polk Township of Montgomery County, Arkansas on 19 September 1850, and Eliza was just 6 months old. So that gives us an approximate birth date of March 1850. And her parents were both born in Missouri, and they'd moved to Arkansas at least by 1848 with the birth of their oldest child, Sarah. So the household had Barnett, age 29, Mary Ann, age 21, little Sarah, age 2, and Eliza Ann, age 6/12.
Love that.
Yeah, isn't it always fun to have the babies' ages broken down by
Yes.
month?
And I think it also gives us a pretty good idea of that indirect evidence that this was a family group and not Eliza with an aunt and uncle or something. Because
Exactly.
usually when they're infants like that, they're still with their mom.
Right, right.
Unless the parents died. I was going to say too that how do you know if an 1850 census represents a family grouping or not? And I was just thinking about how it just comes down to the body of evidence. And when you research all the records for a family, you start to get an idea.
You do. You start to think, okay, wait, I think I'm missing something here. And I think it just comes with experience too, looking at a census and getting a feel for what might be happening there. Well, by 1860, though, life had significantly changed because the father, Barnett, had died somewhere in the mid 1850s. And by 1860, we have Eliza Ann Isenhour in the household of her stepfather, Esquire Blevins. So this is one of those blended censuses. And in this case, we do have the different surnames that help us sort out who is who. So we have Squire Blevins and Mary Ann Blevins. So Mary Ann had remarried this Squire Blevins, and they're both in their 30s. And then we have a Margaret Blevins, a Luke Blevins, a Richard Blevins, and a Mary Blevins. So we've got children from his first marriage between the ages of 14 and 8. And then we have the Eisenhower children listed. So they're separated out by families, which I think is super helpful. So then we have the Sarah Eisenhower and Eliza, plus 2 more, Texana and John, between ages 6 and 13. And then we have 2 little girls, Emily and California, both Blevins, age 3 and 1, which would be children of Mary Ann and Squire Blevins together. So in this case, in 1860, it really nicely delineates, his children, her children, and their children.
Just by the groupings, right? I love how you can kind of just infer that based on ages and
their surnames. In this case, they did retain their surnames. but the Eisenhower children were Eisenhowers.
Right. Yeah. And that's so lucky because
Doesn't always
when they
happen.
don't have that 10 years later, they didn't have that. And then it's just so nice to be able to see it clearly laid out with the Blevins children listed first. And they're all, they didn't mix them in.
Right.
And so
And their ages make
kind of
sense
separated them.
for, children groupings. They're going right down in age for each grouping of children. So this was a good enumerator. They figured it out.
And you could tell when Barnett died because after the conception of John Eisenhower, who's 6, and before the birth of Emily Blevins, who's 3.
Right. So I think we've always just felt like it was probably about 1855, 1856, which
Right.
makes perfect sense with the birth of those children.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's fun to hear all of this household information and kind of what we had from 1850 to 1860. By 1870, the Blevins and Eisenhower family had moved to Coryell County, Texas. And this time, like I mentioned, the Eisenhower children were listed without their surname Eisenhower, and they were listed as Blevins. But the unusual names Texana and California identified this as that same household of the 1860 enumeration in Johnson County, Texas. And Eliza Ann Isenhour's birth year of 1850 remained constant. So we were able to identify this as the correct family. And they have quite, some interesting names. It's not just
They
Texana and
do.
California. I mean, we have Tennessee Blevins and Hewell Blevins. So
Yes.
those were fun names. Well, let's go through the whole family. So we have Squire Blevins, age 45, born in Tennessee, and then Polly Ann Blevins, age 44, in Missouri. And whenever a Mary becomes a Polly, we can rest assured that that's the same person because that was a nickname for Mary, unless there was another Mary or Polly that the person married. But it's the same. And then we have Richard Blevins, Eliza Ann Blevins, Texana Blevins, and Polly Ann Blevins, and John Blevins. So those, Eliza Ann, Texana, Polly, and John, those were actually supposed to be Eisenhowers. They were listed as Blevins. And then we have Tennessee Blevins and California Blevins, Hewell Blevins, Jane Blevins, Martha Blevins, and Jacob Blevins, all the way down to age 4 for Jacob. So, wow. Well, soon after the 1870 census enumeration, Eliza married William Henderson Shults on July 4th, 1871, in Bell County, Texas. And when new land opened further west in Brown County, Texas, William applied for a grant from the state of Texas. In 1878, he stated that he is now a bona fide settler upon 160 acres of land that he believes to be of the public vacant lands of the state of Texas, that he is improving said land as a homestead and has no other, and further that he is a married man and makes this affidavit for the purpose of obtaining a home. Said land is situated in Brown County. So the survey and the map reveal the location of the land and the neighbors. So that was a cool record to have.
Right. Well, I was just going to say that I love that Texas land record because it's all digitized in full color and it has the survey map, which is just so neat to look at. So, yeah, Texas land grants are fabulous if you can find those. And I didn't have this for the longest time until those were digitized and I became aware of them. And it was neat to get one more piece of the puzzle for him because he died so young and left very, very few records. So the land record was really great.
Oh, yeah. I guess I haven't thought about the fact that William Henderson Schultz died young, but it is nice when you can gather even more details about those people who had relatively shorter lives and few records.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Well, this young family was listed only once on the census with their father, William, in 1880. So, since all the children were born since the marriage in 1871, this is kind of the only time they're listed with their father. 4 children had been born to them, and this awesome census had relationships and birthplaces of parents. So, that was nice. But it's also the first census with a conflicting birth year for Eliza, 1848. Perhaps William was the unknown informant and he just forgot his wife's age. He was like, oh, she's a little bit younger than her true age of 30. He was like, she's just 29 forever.
Or else Eliza was the informant and she was in denial that she was now 30, you know.
Well, she probably forgot. I keep forgetting my age, so I can
That's
relate.
true.
It's not fun to keep track of your age anymore as an adult.
It's so true.
How old am I? I don't know. So this enumeration started off with the head of household, William H. Shults, the head of household, age 30, born in Texas, with parents born in Mississippi. Then Eliza A. Shults, the wife, age 28, which we know she was 30, and birthplace of Arkansas, with parents born in Pennsylvania and Arkansas. Then we have daughter Mary R. Shults, age 7, Sarah C. Shults, daughter, age 5, William H. C. Shults, son, age 3, and Rosa A. Shults, daughter, age 2.5, and all these children born in Texas. Well, in 1884, William died of injuries from the horse accident, and Eliza was left a widow expecting another child. Ooh, that would be a hard time to lose your husband. Well, when Henderson Elizabeth Shults was born on February 17th, 1885, she was named for her deceased father, as you can tell, Henderson. With several young children, Eliza needed to remarry to survive economically on the frontier. Her sister Sarah had also died recently, possibly in childbirth, leaving behind her husband, Jacob Meek, and 9-year-old son, James H. Meek. With their spouses deceased, Eliza Ann Isenhour Shults and Jacob Meek, the widower of Sarah Eisenhower, got married to each other on July 25th, 1885. They had a son named Calvin Wesley Meek, who was born in 1887.
Well, right after that marriage, they had Indian Territory become an option for moving north. And this happened because in 1887, a series of legislative acts of the U.S. government resulted in 3 federal court divisions within Indian Territory. So we had the Northern District, Southern District, and Central District. And by the late 1890s, all the real authority in Indian Territory was held by these courts. So before that, non-citizens could not own land in Indian Territory because the land was communal property of the respective Indian tribe. And as a result, a lease system was incorporated, allowing a settler to lease land from the Native Americans. But under the 1887 General Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act, the communal lands of the 5 civilized tribes began to be parceled out to individual members of the tribe, and Indian reservations were surveyed and established. And to qualify for a parcel of land, an individual was required to give their name, tribe, membership designation, age group, and percentage of tribal blood by inheritance. So I knew that this family all ended up in Indian Territory. And of course, this probably led to that family lore of Eliza Ann being full-blooded Cherokee. So I really needed to research them and research this move and try to figure out when they actually did move north to Indian Territory. Were they part of the land grab of 1889? Did they qualify for tribal membership? Was she really full-blooded Cherokee? What about Jacob? So this was a really nebulous part of the family history, figuring out all of this. And one of the main problems was that the 1890 census no longer exists. That would have given so much clarity to know, okay, 1890, they're right there in Indian Territory, but instead we only have them in 1880 in Texas, 1900 in Indian Territory, leaving 20 years of not knowing what's going on. But we do get some information because when they went to enroll as a member of the 5 civilized tribes, filling out their application and proving residence in Indian Territory, they put down that they had been there since 28 June 1898. And because the land disputes were so common in this era, there were so many records generated, and those all became part of an individual's enrollment packet. Well, searching for Jacob and Eliza Meek, I found Jacob Meek's enrollment packet, and he clearly stated that he was 1/4 Choctaw, and their son Calvin was 1/8 Choctaw, and Eliza had no Native American bloodlines, and she was a non-citizen. So finding that record was so great because I finally found that little kernel of information that she had married a man who was a quarter Choctaw. And somehow, down the years, that story grew or changed, or someone just didn't know exactly what was happening and started that story.
Yeah, that was a wonderful piece of direct evidence to answer your research question. And we don't always get that. So it's exciting when you read a historical record that answers your research question directly.
It really is. And at this time period, I looked at a lot of the different Meek family members, Jacob Meek's surname, as I was trying to figure out. There were a couple other Jacob Meeks, always that thing of trying to identify the correct person among people of the same name. And I noticed that there were a lot of couples, a lot of families that were very, very similar, where either the man or the woman was part Cherokee or Choctaw or Chickasaw, one of the 5 civilized tribes, but then their spouse was listed as a non-citizen. And so it was just really interesting to see how the population had blended in this area quite a bit, because the 5 civilized tribes had been out in Indian Territory since the 1830s. They'd been there a long time. So,
Hmm.
those records are really fun to explore and just
Yeah.
look through.
Yeah. For a client project, I found a treasure trove of information in one of the applications that I found. And it's amazing some of the records that are attached. I found a divorce record attached, and they just
Nice.
had to prove a lot of things. So there were witness statements and all kinds of things.
Yes, because what they would do is they would take the person, like Jacob Meek, and they would interview him sometimes 2 or 3 times, and that's all in the packet. They're trying to see if you're making up a story, are you going to tell the same facts over and over and over? Are you really giving the truth here, or what? So you get a lot of documents sometimes in those packets.
Wow.
Well, let's do a word from our sponsor, newspapers.com. Discover your mom in the paper when you search newspapers.com. Find the stories that made her who she is today by searching the largest online newspaper archive. Newspapers.com makes it easy to find your mom, grandma, and others in the papers. Search more than 945 million pages from major news titles to small town papers. Uncover birth and marriage announcements, obituaries, photos, and much, much more. Explore papers dating back to 1690 or as recent as last month. Newspapers.com is used by millions of people every month for genealogy, historical research, and more. Find something you like? With newspapers.com, it's a snap to save and share articles with family and friends, or attach them directly to your ancestry tree. Use promo code FamilyLocket for a 20% discount on your subscription. That's code FamilyLocket, and celebrate the stories of a lifetime with newspapers.com.
Well, let's talk now about the period of Eliza's life when she's living in Garvin County. The records showed that Eliza and Jacob Meek and their family came to the Chickasaw Nation Indian Territory by about 1892. They settled in the area that would become Garvin County, Oklahoma in 1907 when Oklahoma became a state. An early history of that area explained that it was known as Washita Valley, and it was composed almost entirely of sod. An early settler named Smith Paul built the first home in the 1850s, and he began clearing and cultivating the land. He found out that once the sod was broken, the soil produced well, and so the area began to be known as Smith Paul's Valley. And by the time the Shults Meek family arrived, the name had been shortened to just Paul's Valley. I love that story because, of course, I've heard you talk about Paul's Valley so much and never knew the story behind it.
I know, isn't that fun
Hmm.
to kind of learn a little bit more about the beginnings?
Yeah, I often will look up the word etymology for different words and names, and just it's something interesting. Well, going back to our story, before the early 1900s, the land in Paul's Valley had belonged to the Chickasaw Nation and could not be personally owned. And a man could farm all he could enclose within a fence or break with a plow. The history of Garvin County discussed the impact of the coming of the Santa Fe Railroad in 1887. And it talked about how a lively settlement grew up in the valley at the old town site that included a store, stage stops, a wagon yard, and a number of log houses. The railroad was granted a 50-foot easement on either side of the track that went completely through the Chickasaw Nation. The coming of the railroad also meant that there were new settlers coming, and that fertile valley soil drew settlers from all over. Jacob and Eliza Meek settled in the small community of Elmore City. The Church of Christ held gospel meetings in a tent or under a brush arbor, and then began holding weekly services in the log schoolhouse. Some of Eliza's descendants belonged to the Church of Christ, so possibly this was a family affiliation.
Really soon after they had moved there, in 1898, Eliza died and was buried in Elmore. She had only been in Indian Territory about 6 years, and she left, a second husband and children. With the death of their father, the Shults children were left parentless. So their father had died in 1884 in Texas from the horse accident, and now their mother has also died. And they had all gone to Indian Territory, and on the 1900 census are listed there. And all but the oldest daughter also married in Indian Territory. So, with Eliza dying relatively young and her children growing up in the territory, perhaps their stepfather's Choctaw heritage gave rise to this story that Eliza was a full blooded Cherokee. But the records tell another story. And in 1896, as we discussed, Jacob and his two sons, James and Calvin Meek, had applied for and were granted citizenship in the Choctaw Nation by blood. And Jacob stated he was a quarter Choctaw and his sons were an eighth Choctaw. And with Eliza listed as a non-citizen with no tribal bloodline, we can put to rest that idea that she was full-blooded Cherokee. So in this case, this family lore just probably grew out of that little piece of information about Jacob Meek and him being a Choctaw. Who knows how these things get started, but doing our research, sometimes we actually can find the truth of a story. And I know there are plenty of people that have stories of Cherokee ancestors, and sometimes you really can't find any details like I found here that can prove or disprove it. But you never know until you do the research. So I'm glad that those records were available and I was able to do the research and dispel that family myth.
I am too, and I think it's a really good learning case because so many people do have this story in their family history. And so just knowing that it could be false and that there could be a reason why it's there but still be false could be helpful for them. And then it could be true as well, and you can just do your research, you can do your DNA testing and see what you can find out. But even if you don't show any Native American DNA, you may still have a Native American ancestor further back in your tree because we don't inherit DNA from all of our more distant ancestors. We only inherit DNA reliably from like up to our second great grandparents. And then after that, some of them will fall off of our genetic family tree just due to random recombination. Well, I love that you came up with a theory for why this myth was passed down. And it makes perfect sense that with Eliza dying relatively young and her children growing up in Indian Territory with, their younger brothers being 1/8 Choctaw and their stepfather being 1/4 Choctaw, they were surrounded by others who were citizens of the nation. So it's just interesting to think about how they maybe just misunderstood or somebody misunderstood and or didn't pass on the information correctly or just people's memories failing. But I was thinking about the fact that women were often the vehicle for sharing family history information. And so with Eliza not living to an older age to pass on family history stories and things to her children and grandchildren, it's not too surprising that this oral history that popped up was a little bit false.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's just interesting that it came down through multiple branches of the family, and you just wonder where it got started.
Yeah, there was somebody who was either just exaggerating the information. And I think there's some sort of sense that it would be cool or interesting to be a Native American or to have a Native American in their family tree. And so who knows?
You just never know what motivates people. And so it's totally possible that maybe there was a reason why they wanted to say that, she was full blooded Cherokee.
All right. Well, great research. Thanks for writing about this. It's wonderful to have these profiles of our ancestors that you're writing. And it's just great to have the research put into a nice format with the footnotes and fully documented. So I hope our listeners who are thinking about writing about their families can also think of ways to write short biographies or profiles of ancestors that they've researched and be able to preserve the stories for the future.
All right. Well, everyone have a great week, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.